culture and tradition still are the key terms in the ethnic classification in modern Russia. And we see with modern Russian legislation, we see it, population size, territorial or ancestral land, traditional way of life, which makes us vulnerable, which is also very important. In any program that you can see, any program of development of indigenous peoples of Russia, you can see that we must be protected because we are vulnerable. And my kind of very everyday question, because I'm myself labeled as indigenous, was why we're so vulnerable? Why you need to protect us? What makes us vulnerable? What is the source of our vulnerability? And the source of our vulnerability is also a way of how we live, traditional way of life. But who constructed our traditional way of life when the culture was a target and we were completely changed under the Soviet project of modernization through culture. So, and moving next. And my sub questions here: who in practice constructed and transmitted the representation of indigenous peoples? Yeah. How did the wider society, I mean majority, learn about us, our tradition, culture, and way of life, and for what purposes were they or our development and social positions were imagined? So, and you can see there are my inspiration references. And I found a book. It's kind of fresh book. If you know English language, I strongly recommend to read this. Very interesting reading. It's by Elena Danilova. It's ethnological expertise and theory and practice of contemporary Russian scholarship. But she not just focusing on the contemporary Russian scholarship. She also traces the history of ethnography, and I'll call them ethno-specialists, ethno-apparatus, in Soviet and contemporary Russia. The half of her book devoted to the Soviet period as well. And I'm standing on shoulders of giants. Of course, there is a Young and his study on the hybridity of race and culture, where he argued that race were invented for culture and culture were invented for race. Also, Elizabeth Pavanelli, is actually her close reading of ethnographical accounts on indigenous peoples in Australia really inspired me, because where she like brilliantly traced how the recognition through state-defined cultural ethnicity for indigenous peoples operates still in neoliberal agenda in Australia. And also there is a Russian, Mogilner Marina, her brilliant book Homo Imperia, where she traces how race operated as a category of imperial modernity and how were inherited in Soviet Union. Even the Soviet Union rejected race. They were still operating there, but it became the culture. Racism and race shifted to the culture and was one of the elements of hierarchy between peoples. And it's Prof. Grey Morning, and what Prof says about indigenous peoples as special citizen. So we occupy not just decent but very weird position. So we're not fully included, but we are not fully excluded from the national body. Okay, and here, I don't know why, but I cannot move it. Let me move somewhere. It's so weird. I'm sorry. Let me share it again. Sorry for interrupting. I just can, yeah, now I know how I can, yep. Because I want to read this extras from her book, and I want to start from the author of the book that I was using for the close reading. She called it the credo of Soviet policy toward the indigenous peoples, and it was stated in 1957. When it declared that in the past many of these people had no written language, led predominantly nomadic lives, and were doomed to extinction as a result of the socialist transformation. With the fraternal assistance of all people of the Soviet Union, the peoples of the far north have largely adopted the sedentary way of life. And you can see the opposition. Nomadic lives, now sedentary way of life makes us progress. We were no written language, doomed to extinction. Now we developed our economy. And we also produce a significant group at their own intelligentsia. means that we were educated. So my mom were quite educated. She was taken at age of 9 from her family, forcibly were put into the special boarding school for indigenous kids. She didn't speak Russian, and for speaking their languages, indigenous languages, they were punished. Like they all was like beaten, and the price the indigenous people for being educated were very high. And what we can see next, there were two types of text. One kind of texts that were reported broadly to celebrate civilization mission was an example. But there are another type of confidential memorandums for Soviet bureaucrats, for ministers, commissions, special departments on indigenous people, etc. And they reported there the difficulties of the project of modernization. For instance, you can see here the transition of syntheticization accompanied by the resettlement of indigenous populations into villages led to their detachment from traditional subsistence territories and depopulated vast areas of the north, which are no longer being used by humans. The attempt to transform the immense space of the Soviet North into inhabited desert is dangerous. Also, from a defense standpoint, we see that's a military discourse as well, and also the praise that you just cannot abandon a lot of territory. The next example is about syntheticization. It itself doesn't save the people of the North from extinction. Ethnographers and anthropologists were admitted it. Therefore, one cannot consider correct the resolution, blah blah blah, which also that there were the plan to change the way of life of indigenous population within 2-3 years, and they say it's just you cannot do it. It may bring not benefit but harm. Another example, this measure, which incidentally is not supported by reindeer herders, has divided, this measure I mean sanitarization, collectivization, has divided families, splitting the household into two parts, which is clearly harmful both for the economic and the family and for its moral foundation. And you can see here that the ethnographers, anthropologists, and I call them ethno-specialists, they admitted that people were resisting. They didn't want this kind of changes. But despite these difficulties, the project of modernization indigenous people through culture never stopped. And we can see the last memorandums in 80s, last century, 1980s, what they reported in that secret classified report, the loss of indigenous languages. There were also conflicts on ethnic, racist discrimination based between settlers and indigenous people. Lower wages, poor housing, the displacement of indigenous peoples from traditional branches of the economy, because the indigenous economy wasn't so benefited how the Soviet project expected. So occupation of the most leadership and specialist positions by settlers, everyday racism, harm from industrial projects, and these industrial projects started in 60s last century, and actually it was the shift between indigenous peoples and developing indigenous people. There was shift in 60s into developing territories that destroy reindeer pastures and the culture and the very existence of indigenous peoples now again under the threat. And I see this the in that book that I use as example of close reading, that never mentioning this kind of critical analysis, what I call academic amnesia in Russia. Indigenous peoples effectively became a testing ground for the experiments and all hypotheses of Soviet ethnographs and anthropologists. There was back and forth, something you cannot do. Okay, try next, something new. They were very creative. The transformation of culture was made a priority in these experiments, and ethnographers and anthropologists were responsible for analyzing and determining which of the backward traditions should be eradicated and which might be adapted as socialist project for the purposes of developing the North. And also, I propose the concept souvenir identity, which shows and helps us to see that how vulnerability centered in this project and still operates. Indigenous identities are fixed and displayed as a stable cultural images to be recognized, while the ongoing colonial relations that produce these images remain unchanged. It is grounded in culture as a marker of hierarchy, but also function as an outlet within the factor of identities. Diverse and changing indigenous practices are channeled into narrow, frozen image of culture that is stripped of political potential and tightly controlled in its relation to history. As a result, indigenous peoples are encouraged to publicly display culture as one of the legitimate way of being indigenous. Performing culture in exchange for access to spaces, the cultural representations become not only a source of income, but also a necessary condition for assessing rights, legal protection, quotas, and subsidies. And these state-granted privileges are not grounded in acknowledgement of this asymmetrical power relation that produce indigenous peoples' vulnerability. It's that vulnerability itself explained through culture, which of course shift attention away from the historical political conditions when we were constructed. As a conclusion, culture were like served as a million of ways simultaneously as a marker of difference, cause of backwardness, justification for modernising intervention, and measure of progress. And I also argue that under the Soviet project of modernization, the traditional way of living indigenous populations will completely changed. And when I see in Russian legislation traditional way of living, my question, what is traditional? You just change us, not even 100 years ago that you change us completely. But dark side of the social experiment was captured in classified reports. But the problems they documented were largely treated as matters requiring further intervention rather than grounds for questioning the project itself. And also, I also like talking about move when the Soviet Union collapsed, that were shift that I observed from strategic essentialism to strategic constructivism, but they still with the main role as a government of the architecture of identities. That's all for now. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope that I was clear with my argumentation. Would be happy to hear your questions.
Right. Do we have questions?
Actually, I have a question. Start.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you argue, now I'm just asking, can we argue that the stronger the culture, the harder it was to raise the indigenous people? For example, like during the Soviet Union time. Now, I'm not an expert.
I'm sorry, Kale, can you please proceed to the laptop so I can hear you properly? Because it's so super far.
Rotate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry for that. But I hardly hear you.
I'm not sure if I can bring the laptop to him.
Can you rotate it?
Well, it's the mic that's the problem.
Oh.
Who's the question? Who's asking question?
That mic is supposed to be on.
Come and ask me. I'm sorry, guys.
Huh? Well, it's not on. For some reason, it's not on, and I'm not sure where.
Yeah.
Who is asking the question?
I can't hear it. So.
Okay. Can you hear
Maybe
now?
they just can come closely.
Just 1 second.
Okay.
Can you
sorry.
hear?
Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliantly. Yeah, thank you.
You can hear?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So my question is, can you argue that the stronger the culture, the harder it is to raise the indigenous identity during the Soviet Union time? Now, again, I'm not an expert, but from noticing from outside, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, right, you still had Chechens, you had Tatars. So from outside, I didn't see they were trying to, like Chechens still had their own identity. Now, can you comment? So what's the difference between, for example, the Chechens under the Soviet time and North Siberia? Why were the Chechens, the Soviet Union wasn't able to erase their culture? I think now. Like, I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say.
I absolutely understand that the
Okay.
purpose was not to erase the culture. The purpose was to change it so it could be adapted to the Soviet project, to the socialist project. There wasn't ever the target to erase it. And also that I can question back, define stronger culture. You see, what does it mean, stronger culture? And as well, you can see that it's that the Soviet project, also the white culture. It's like it's not. It was changed, and some elements of its culture that served of the Soviet project were preserved. And also we must remember that there is the project of ethnic federalization. Ethnic federalization is one of the key pillars of a constructing of a Soviet state and now modern Russian state. There were also the target was change culture, so it became a part of Soviet socialist project and preserve some elements that serve its purposes. You see, it's not, we cannot see like simply good or bad, erased or not. Yeah, I'm not a specialist in that Caucasian region, but I can absolutely clearly say that project of modernization embraced the whole all populations in Soviet state.
Okay. So if I
Anyone,
understand you correctly,
anyone,
so go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Go
anyone
ahead.
could be back away. All people were modernized. You
Okay.
see, all
So
people were modernized.
the Soviet Union wasn't trying to change all the culture, right? They were trying to change
Ooh.
certain parts of the culture that don't fit their project, right?
Yes,
Like
that's
that's
correct.
what they were trying to do.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's correct. Yeah, thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.
I think you need to
I see Sid has raised his.
Yeah. I'm interested in the process, Katya. And
Mhm.
did settlers from the European areas come in to do this? Did administrators from the central government come in to implement these changes? In other words, how did it work?
Super question. How it worked? The people just came. They most of it ethno specialists they've been living at that territories. They were one of the tasks of the project, living there, observing, reporting, also inventing some interventions, and immediately implemented in a wavelength. And of course there were a lot of military control. Some of indigenous communities like Hanti-Mansi, for instance, they were resistant military because they were hunters and they had guns. And there were for instance there were a huge resistance to the boarding schools, and they were against it. So the Soviet project sent airplanes and they murdered. It was a massacre. A lot of hunters, like men, and indigenous women were like at the age of extinction. It was in 1937, 38. But actually there is also interesting like shift between 20s and the project by Lenin and the project by Stalin. There's something happening here between 20s and 30s. Yeah, and the massacre and the murdering, they were happening under Stalin's rule, not Lenin's. You see, and also it's quite not clear for me, but I hope that I'm answering your
Well,
question.
just as a brief follow-up,
Mm-hmm,
what was produced in these
mm-hmm,
areas? Now, these are hunting and foraging people to a self-subsistence. What did the Soviets want them to produce that would
mm-hmm.
contribute to the development of Soviet society?
So it depends on the time. Before this, the rise of extract projects like oil, gas, which happened in 60s, in 50s and 60s. Before that, the Soviet
Extraction of what? Wait, I didn't understand that.
extraction, oil, gas, it happened
Oh,
in
there's oil and gas in that area.
No. It depends on a time. So the earlier Soviet project expected from indigenous population to become a system of a Soviet economy. So they
Which
really
is
expect
what? Which is
which
what?
is which is fur, which is reindeer meat, fish, like all the traditional economy that they call indigenous economy. They expected it to be the part of the whole Soviet economy, but it never happened. So in
So I'll do that, but I
60s,
don't
when
want to
the race of
disconnect.
extractivism
I'll wait till we
started,
finish.
the shift from development indigenous people become a part of economy. There was shift to developing land, like in terms of extractivism. And
Yeah,
it
but if
happened
I
in
push
50s,
the
60s.
PC, am I
So
gonna?
indigenous peoples were like back, like a background for the extractivism. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
All right, so I'm gonna wait for that. All right,
Uh-huh.
thanks.
Uh-huh. Feeling?
I'm gonna,
If
go
I
ahead,
may, I wanted to
Taylor.
mention that the sort of silver lining to this meticulous documentation of a very large bureaucracy is that you have these memorandums. And I was wondering, how were they difficult to obtain? That's information that I don't know if we have an equivalent in the United States of these kinds of very systematic memoranda. So I'm very impressed by your ability to find them and
It's not
use
me,
them.
it's that expert Danilova. I just took her book and
I see.
critically read it.
Okay.
She found everything, but there was
She's very
not an
impressive.
inch of there was not an inch of critical observation actually. She was or moreover she says in that book that that's secret memorandum, it was a brain of anthropologists, ethnographers to staying against Soviet project, but it wasn't like this because they never stopped. They reported that difficulties, but they never stopped the social experiment on indigenous peoples.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
It's very revealing. Thank you. Really, really interesting. Thank you for the paper. Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I found out what the problem is. That mic is not connected.
Oh.
I'm going to have to log out when we're done with this, log out and log back in to get that
I
mic
see it.
working.
To your question follow up. Which I'm already okay. Let me type it. Let me text.
Okay, thank you, first of all, Ekaterina, for a beautiful talk. There was a question about Chechnya, right? And the language. And I'm wondering, actually, I might be wrong. It's a small Muslim area, Chechnya, in the Caucasus Mountains, very rich in oil. And it was invaded by the Russians twice or three times. Please correct me. So do you think the Russians were even more interested in the oil than destroying the culture, which they have done, of course, because there are many native Russians live there. So I don't know if my question is making sense, comment and a question. I just feel since this is such a small area, it was easy to invade it, sounds sad, but they were more interested in that oil wealth than the people.
It's not,
they never cared about the people, did they?
It's not just about extractivism for Russia, like as for any state. It's about territorial integrity, which part of Russian identity. And we can see it like someone, you cannot just give up some piece of your land. It's not just about something in this land. It's a part of Russian imperialism as well. It's a part of identity, like national building. The Russian nationalism is built around the territorial integrity.
They were trying to create a nation, out of
And they
diverse
still doing it.
species. They're still
They
doing
still
it.
doing it.
And you can compare this with the United States, for example, that we also were building a nation, and we did it, though, by replacing or trying to replace indigenous people, particularly as we moved west from the Mississippi River. And settlers came in, were given land, and pushed the indigenous people onto reservations. That was the process that we used. I think the Soviets didn't do something comparable to this.
Absolutely not. No. The Soviet project, it was more about modernizing than this genocidal intention, you see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was
It's more
not
about
the
modernizing.
people, it was not a replacement people modernizing. It was trying to modernize the indigenous people.
Yeah. But they were replacement by Stalin. They were ethnic cleaning, as I would say. It was quite genocidal. There were Chechens were deported, Kalmyk people were deported. That's some part of, but it wasn't like to compare the American colonial project. I would say that the American was like the emptying land for themselves. But then the Soviet wasn't like this. It wasn't emptying land for us. It was like, let's move people so they become less threat. If they survive, okay,
All
not
right.
survive. Like,
There will be a time to continue this conversation right before lunch. So we have another speaker coming on. I have to switch out of this
thank
laptop
you.
and switch on to. So I'm going to close the session and then reopen it.